Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 6 from the 2013 World Chess Championship match between Anand and Carlsen. Going into this round, Carlsen takes a 3-2 lead over Anand, and Anand with the white pieces in this one opens with e4, as was the case in Games 2 and 4 of this match. And we follow Game 4. We enter the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense, and it is here where we now have an adjustment. Instead of castles, we now have d3, reinforcing e4, not allowing its capture, and now bishop c5. You cannot win e5, keep in mind. At the end of it, you're not just winning the pawn back, you are now losing, so we won't have that. What we do have is what's quite common, looking to now build in the center with d4, both sides castle, both sides get their rooks working, reinforcing their e-pawns and also vacating the f1 and f8 squares for minor pieces. This is a common maneuver for white with the queen knight and also for black with the bishop to play to g7, which would watch over the dark squares. This pawn will often like to watch over the f5 square in order to combat the knight who could jump into that point. So we don't have those maneuvers just yet. We do have the maneuver on the white side eventually, but first a question to the bishop. White is not going to give up the bishop pair, staying quite active, pointing right at the king. And now how exactly to get out of this pin? What might be tried, and maybe quite tempting, is to play h6 and then g5, but you certainly always have to be wary of some sacrifice on g5. If you just lash out like this could be problematic. How exactly get out of this pin? And right around their corner, there could maybe be more pressure being placed against that knight. Not so easy to untangle. So we'll see exactly how you can deal with this particular pin without having to move your pawns like so. First is bishop e6, knight d2. A question is thrown to the bishop. Will it keep the knight in a pin or go elsewhere? Keeps the knight in a pin. Bishops come off. The rook is now able to pinpoint a6. And now we're seeing the way that black will cope with this pin. The knight will be responsible for defending him, and then the queen will eventually get off of that diagonal. h3 is a flight square, and the knight will also look to reposition and maybe hit that pinned piece. Knight d7, knight h2, queen e7, and knight f1. A lot of maneuvering. No great fireworks happening in this game. No haymakers being thrown just yet. A lot of improvements being made for the pieces, getting them to better positions. And with this last move, bishop b6, initially I thought it was to maybe free up the c-pawn. Sometimes you'll see that out of this opening, but I believe that that is simply bad here. There would at the very least be a good reply in that of c4. Keep in mind what this particular move would do. It would weaken d5, and this knight, you could be sure, would not be long off from hopping to that square. So what is the intention if it's not to get the c-pawn involved? Well, this is a quite common idea right here. This is a quite common idea for white, to play b4 and clamp down on the black position, get the one doubled pawn rolling, so maybe at least this pawn can move one day. It's really aimed at trying to clamp down on the a6 pawn. And so black wants to be in a position to eliminate what could be potentially a target by playing a5. So now the bishop's there at least to support that idea. Knight e3, queen e6, finally off of the diagonal. b4 comes, and sure enough, we have black making sure they get rid of their potential liability on the a file. Those pawns are exchanged, and why not try to exchange a not so well placed knight on h2 for one that is perfectly central on f6. That's the idea, and don't blink, because before you know it, we now have all minor pieces off the board, and we're stripped to a completely heavy endgame with just the major pieces, rooks and queens. One quick point to make is that this move might have been tempting, but be mindful of f2. Queen or bishop can snip that pawn. So instead it's queen g4. Both sides now have their rooks in direct contact with one another. We do have some structural defect here on the white side, but this has all the makings of a draw. So what exactly to do with the rook, how exactly to improve, because right here we have tension between the rooks, but neither side really does well to take the rook, because it would help out the other to then have complete control over the a file. So queen e7, king. If you're to make a tucking in type of move as black, king h7, keep in mind what it would be allowing, right? King h7, queen d7 is very disruptive, hitting the rook, the pawn, the one on b5, and eventually you could see that the a file will also be taken over by white by putting pressure on the a8 square. So you definitely don't allow that. Queen e7 is there to defend. Rook f1, why not? White is perfect here, having the rook on an open file and a half open file. And what exactly is this rook doing on e8? Not really a whole lot. c5 is played, looking to mix it up a little bit in the center, looking to play c4 and strike at d3. King h2 tucks the king in a little bit, and c4 does get played. And as the reply, we have d4. If you capture the pawn, notice what is happening with that structural change. As white, you would now have double isolated pawns. That's not a great thing. And the other detail, well, now b2 would be accessible to the black pieces, or more accessible to the black pieces. So we don't have this capture. It is d4. And with that, black, it seems, can be winning a pawn on e4. After this capture, there's clearly a couple pieces that will be brought to life, and then e4 can fall in a blink. But we don't have that. We have first Carlsen giving up control over the a file, and now queen to b7. This was surprising to me. I thought that the follow-up would have been to capture on d4, but why wasn't that played? Isn't black just winning a pawn? Well, not so fast, because sure, you win a pawn, but it's very temporary. At the end of it, a check is thrown in, and the rook sneaks right behind the pawn and will win the pawn. There's no way to defend it. And at the end of it, the rook remains very active defense, and maybe even one of these two pawns would fall. So not the direction to go in. The white rook would be perfect defending the base point and still staying active after grabbing the pawn on b5. So that's not the line we go down, not the road we see. Instead, after giving up control of the a file, the queen now plays to b7. Well, what's the idea behind this? Well, it is to take now with the pawn and then take with the rook, keeping more pieces on the board. It's a different story if the queens are on the board still. If it's just the rooks, it's certainly looking more drawish. So queen to b7. Notice she is also watching over potential entry points by the rook. And again, pointing right at that e4 point. Rook d1 is there, very nice, and if this pawn is taken, the rook simply recaptures and is right there to defend e4. Queen c7 or queen c6, we have a couple queen moves thrown in. The main thing here is that white needs to watch over e4, black needs to watch over d6, and not too much change will occur at this point with regard to the pawn structure. So let's see how things progress. First, the rook takes up a nice post on e5, queen c7, a lot of shuffling here, and we don't really see too much for a little bit. These last handful of moves by black improved the king position ever so slightly. That's the best that black can really do with the king position. And during the game, I must admit, I thought that if f5 wasn't going to be played, I didn't see any life to this position whatsoever, but we end up seeing some pawns being captured, and the structure does change in some way. So king g7, queen f3, the rook drops back, and now queen to g3, basically saying, go ahead, take my pawn, and enter a position where you could be up a pawn. And I see a way that I can defend. That's essentially what's going on here, because the following sequence of moves will show that much. We're now going to enter a position where Carlsen is up a pawn, but has a very passive rook versus a white rook, which is very versus a white rook, which is very active. So that's what we see. Rook takes on e, queen takes d, and now rook takes e3. The queens come off. Rook d5, rook to b7. What do we have? Black is up a pawn, but this rook is very, very active. I do want to point out one variation here where you'll note if black captures on d6 here and then captures on e3, note that there is rook to d5, and now white is simply ready to win this pawn. There could then be b4, and after its capture, rook to b3. These pawns will now be exchanged, and we're certainly entering what is likely to be a drawn position, similar to what we saw in game 4, where Anand had the white pieces, and it turned out to be a 2 versus 1 in favor of Carlsen, but with still the rooks on the board, a pair of rooks on the board, it was a very much so holdable position, and Anand was able to draw that. We will have a similar thing going on here. It may be a little bit more difficult, but if we do enter a position where it's a 3-2, that is still looking like it's a drawn position. We could have something like this where the rook ends up coming over, the kings get involved. Eventually we could have all of these pawns being exchanged, and what we will eventually have here is yet again something like this, a 3 versus 2. This is, I think, what white is looking for, to exchange the pawns so that we just have pawns on one side of the board. Now, how are things a little bit different here when you don't take? Well, by taking on e3 first and allowing the rook to be on e7 in response to rook d5, now you could at least defend the pawn with rook to b7. In the previous position that I just showed, the rook would have been on e3 and would not be in this position to defend b5 after white's playing the rook to d5. Rook to b7, super passive, and this rook is super active, cutting now off the king. Again, white down a pawn, but very, very active rook, not allowing now the black king to contribute, not allowing the black king to get towards the center so easily. f6 first, h5 is played. A decent amount of time was spent on that one, about 12 minutes. This is aimed at disrupting the pawn structure, looking to strike at the center and induce some weaknesses, and sure enough, we do see that. Anand gives up yet another pawn in order to smash open this pawn structure. So now white is down 2 pawns, but still with a very active rook, and now this is a very ugly, a very messy black pawn structure. It seems like one of these 3 pawns will fall soon enough. Rook to d5, pinpoints, h5, white king gets involved, rook to b6, rook to c5. Rook to c5 is really saying, you know what, if you ever think about playing your pawn to b4, I'm going to take c4 right away. And what's also worth noting is that instead of, let's say, rook to b6, let's just say b4 is played. The follow-up would be the rook to play to c5. Takes. At the end of it, you cannot defend c4. White will be winning that pawn soon enough. So we instead have rook to b6, rook to c5, f5, king h4, and now we have Well, black gives up this pawn in exchange for what exactly? Rook activity, looking to now give some checks to the white king, and in doing so is allowing the black king to inch closer into the white position. So the pawn is picked up, a check is thrown in, the white king is inconvenienced, the black king is making a little bit of progress, but really is it going to be enough? The rook is dropping back to maybe give some checks to the black king. We have first h4 being played, so that when there is a check being played, the king can inch over just right there on the h file, tucked in nicely right behind his pawns. There are no more successful checks. If this h pawn weren't around, maybe this is easier for white, right? Maybe this is a very, very important pawn, although doubled. Rook to f8 is hitting the pawn. It is now going to be defended with rook to f4, and maybe there are also ideas of playing to f1, inconveniencing the king, forcing him to go to h2, as otherwise it would be mate on h1. Rook to c8, rook g4, basically just keeping pressure on the c4 pawn. Dropping this pawn would mean that white would have something very valuable connected past pawns. Rook to f8, the rook gives a check, king to g5, rook to g8, and now where exactly to go with the king? If king to f6, keep in mind if the rook is taken, the material is balanced, but this is a completely lost position for white. This pawn negates these two because of the grip on the b3 square, and it's basically 2 versus 1. Game over. White will end up losing this one. So you can't exchange rooks, and that is if king to f6 is even played. You wouldn't see rook takes rook. And if you're playing to f4, well, that means you're going to drop this pawn here, and what does white then have? Connected past pawns. That almost certainly needs to be avoided, but it's not avoided. King to f4 was still played, surprisingly enough, and that means that this pawn is going to fall. So was this a mistake? Well, not so fast. These pawns, while they remain connected, are a long way off from posing a threat to the black side. And so why exactly was this pawn given up? Anand goes right for it. Has there been a mistake? King e3, the pawn is picked up, the white rook is active, and now these pawns are ready to roll. So how does black proceed? Well, it's first f4. And the idea here is that now that the rook is defended, h3 is available. There's a lot of this, to even have gotten into this position, to inject this life into the position, was very creative on black's part. Is it enough, however? These are almost in all cases, these connected passed pawns are extremely valuable. But keep in mind the strong placement of the black king and the not so great position of the white king. So what is f4 doing again? It is watching over the rook so that h3 can be played, threatening the pawn, and after it is captured, what has changed? Well, the f pawn now becomes passed and just 3 steps away from its dream square on f1. So f4 it is, rook to a4, and this is a big slip, and it's certainly maybe easy to go wrong here. Rook to a4 is played. You do have to still be very on top of your game and calculate very well. Rook to a4, the idea behind this is to, well, Anand is anticipating this move. This is clear, and the idea will be to try and give these types of checks to the black king. And so this involves getting the b and c pawns on the 4th rank, which allows the rook to be pivoting on the a1, a2, and a3 squares to keep the king in check. But that is a step in the wrong direction. b4 would have been better, and let's go down this line for a moment and see how white could have proceeded here, and maybe this would have been better. After that exchange, The rook is now dropping back, and now this pawn is ready to roll, but the white rook is also there to keep the king in check, right? With rook to e7 and force it, rook to e7 or rook to d7. For example, if black is pushing, you could give a check. What are you going to do here? You could keep giving a check. If this pawn is ever taken, now he's too far away from defending this pawn, and we could end up having a completely dead drawn position. The other attempt might be to, after give a check, to do something like this, get the king to f1, but black is soon reminded that white also has a passed pawn. It's not so clear how exactly to get this king out of the f-file so that this pawn could advance successfully. This would have been a better approach by white, to say the least, instead of playing the rook to a4 on this move 60. Move 60 enters that new time control, but time in this game was never a factor. Plenty of time at this point for both sides. So rook a4 was played, and sure enough, it is h3, giving up the pawn in order to grant this one a free run to the f1 square. And not too long ago, it was black who was up 2 pawns, and now all of a sudden it is black who is down a pawn. But this pawn is very dangerous on f4. How to stop it? Rook g6 gets out of the way so this pawn could finally march. c4, like I said, these ideas here, these next moves are made so that it allows the rook to be giving check, trying for a lateral defense to kick the king around. f3, rook check, king e2, b4, and now here we have it. Many checks can be thrown into the king. f2 continuing to march, and now we have rook a2, king f3, and before I go any further, there was actually an interesting move that could have been played at this moment here. After Anand's b4, there could be check, and this is an interesting sequence of moves to give another check on g1, and then you're able to advance with check and promote to a queen next. So an interesting motif to be aware of, something that I certainly did not see, to give a check, another check, and then advance to queen. We did not have that, however. After b4, we had f2. This is another approach. The rook gives a check, king to f3. Is there a way to get out of a check? There is. King to f4, and now what? The pawn is ready to promote. Rook to a8. Don't promote so fast. That queen will be won right back. So it is first rook g1, and at this point, Anand resigns. This is game over. There's no way to save this. You can give a check, and the king can play here. You could try to advance with b5, but now comes the queen. You need to give up your rook, and these pawns are not fast enough. They get tracked down right away after something like this. They are frozen with the rook on c5, and one of them will be won next, and not long after the other. So what an interesting game, really pulling what looked to be a drawn position was really converted very nicely into a win here by Carlsen in this game 6. And needless to say, this puts a great deal of pressure on Anand, who is now trailing 4 points to 2. 4 points to 2 in favor of Carlsen at this point right here. Tomorrow is a rest day, and well, we will see what takes place next. It's certainly going to be a very difficult road ahead in order to overcome this deficit in the match. Again, Carlsen is now leading with this second consecutive win with the black pieces, 4-2. We will see what happens in round 7 of this 2013 World Chess Championship. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.